The tumor burst like a rotten fruit, but instead of pus and blood, pure silver spilled into Noel Boon's trembling palm. In the Colorado wilderness of 1887, where men killed for gold dust, this impossible miracle would tear apart families, ignite corporate greed, and force a broken mountain man to choose between fortune and redemption. But when the railroad barons arrived with lawyers and torches, Noel discovered that sometimes God's greatest gifts come wrapped in the deadliest curses. Stay with me until the end of this tale of brotherhood, betrayal, and the price of justice, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels across our great nation. The Colorado Territory stretched endlessly before Noel Boon as he trudged through the knee-deep snow, his weathered boots leaving a solitary trail toward the distant shimmer of Leadville's smokestacks. The December wind bit through his wool coat with the teeth of a starving wolf, but it was nothing compared to the fire burning in his left arm, a fire that had been consuming him for 3 weeks now. At 42, Noel had the lean, rope-muscled build of a man who'd spent half his life wrestling ore from reluctant mountains. His beard, more salt than pepper now, couldn't hide the deep lines etched by 20 years of solitude. The cabin he'd left behind that morning sat empty for the first time since 1868, when he'd fled to these peaks, carrying nothing but guilt, a pickaxe and his brother's blood on his hands. The tumor had started as a tiny bump, no bigger than a tick bite just below his left elbow. Now it bulged beneath his sleeve like a robin's egg, pulsing with each heartbeat and radiating heat that made his wool shirt feel like armor forged in hell's furnace. For 3 nights running, he'd awakened screaming, convinced that something alive was trying to claw its way out of his flesh. "Just a little farther," he muttered through gritted teeth, using the familiar rhythm of self-encouragement that had carried him through 2 decades of hermit's existence. "Just make it to Doc Harrison's. He'll cut the damn thing out, and you can get back to your mountain." But even as he spoke the words, Noel knew something had changed forever. The tumor wasn't just growing, it was moving, shifting beneath his skin like a restless animal. And the dreams, God Almighty, the dreams, silver waterfalls cascading from wounds that never healed, voices calling his name from depths he couldn't fathom. And always, always the face of his brother David, pale and accusing in the moonlight of that terrible night 20 years past. The trail wound through a stand of frost-covered pines, their branches sagging under the weight of new snow. Noel paused to catch his breath, leaning against a massive trunk, while white vapor puffed from his lips like the last sighs of dying men. His arm throbbed with renewed fury, and he pressed his right hand against the swelling, trying to massage away the pain. The moment his fingers made contact, the tumor erupted. It happened without warning. 1 second he was applying gentle pressure, the next his sleeve was soaked with something that wasn't blood, but felt warm and thick as molasses. Noel yanked his hand away with a strangled cry, expecting to see gore and infection painting the pristine snow at his feet. Instead, he stared at his palm in bewildered silence. Silver. Pure, gleaming silver, no bigger than a child's marble, but so bright it seemed to capture and concentrate every ray of winter sunlight filtering through the pine boughs. The metal sat in his cupped hand like a star fallen to earth, its surface smooth and perfect, as if it had been crafted by the finest jeweler in Denver, rather than birthed from diseased flesh. "What in the name of—" Noel whispered, his voice trailing off into the mountain silence. He looked down at his arm, expecting to see a gaping wound where the tumor had been. Instead, there was only unmarked skin beneath his torn sleeve, pale and smooth, as if the grotesque swelling had never existed. No scar, no bruise, no sign that anything unnatural had just occurred, except for the impossible sphere of silver burning like ice in his palm. The wind picked up, setting the pine needles to whispering secrets in a language Noel couldn't understand. He closed his fist around the silver, and immediately a warmth spread up his arm and into his chest, different from the fever heat of the tumor. This was clean warmth, like standing too close to a forge on a winter morning, filling him with strength he hadn't felt in years. "Miracle," he breathed, and then immediately felt foolish for speaking the word aloud. Noel Boon had stopped believing in miracles the night he'd put a bullet in his brother's chest, but as he stood there in the cathedral silence of the mountains holding impossible silver in his work, scarred hand, he couldn't deny what had happened. The tumor was gone, the pain was gone, and in their place was this thing of beauty and mystery that defied every law of nature he'd ever known. A raven cawed somewhere overhead, harsh and mocking. Noel looked up to see the black bird perched on a bare branch, its obsidian eyes fixed on him with unsettling intelligence. For a moment, man and bird regarded each other in perfect stillness. Then the raven spread its wings and took flight, disappearing into the gray sky like a fragment of night torn loose from its moorings. Noel slipped the silver into his coat pocket and resumed his trudge toward town, but now his steps carried a different purpose. This wasn't just about finding a doctor anymore. This was about understanding what had happened to him and what it meant. The trail descended gradually through stands of aspen and pine, following the course of a frozen creek that would rage with snowmelt come spring. Noel had walked this path countless times over the years, carrying ore samples to the assay office or trading furs for supplies, but today every familiar landmark seemed charged with new significance. The split boulder where he'd once sheltered from a lightning storm, the meadow where he'd shot his first elk, the fallen log bridge spanning Miller's Creek, all of it looked the same yet felt utterly transformed, as if he were seeing the world through different eyes. By the time the first buildings of Leadville came into view, the sun had climbed high enough to burn off the morning mist. The town sprawled across the valley floor like a boomtown fever dream, a chaotic mixture of canvas tents, wooden shacks, and more substantial brick buildings that spoke of newfound prosperity. Smoke rose from 100 chimneys, and the constant din of mining operations created a percussion that never stopped day or night. Noel had been coming to Leadville since its founding 9 years earlier, but he'd never grown comfortable with the crowds and noise. Too many people meant too many questions, too many chances for someone to recognize his name or remember old stories better left buried. He kept his head down as he entered the town proper, making his way through streets that squelched with a mixture of snow mud and horse manure. The silver in his pocket seemed to pulse with each step, its warmth radiating through the thick wool of his coat. He found himself touching it compulsively, reassuring himself that it was real, that the whole experience hadn't been some fever-induced hallucination brought on by whatever poison the tumor had been leaking into his system. Doc Harrison's office occupied the ground floor of a 2-story clapboard building on State Street, distinguished by a painted sign that read "Medical and Dental Services," in letters large enough to be read by half-blind miners stumbling home from the saloons. Noel had been there twice before, once for a dislocated shoulder suffered in a cave-in, and once for a knife wound that had refused to heal properly. Harrison was competent enough, and more importantly, he asked few questions about how his patients had acquired their injuries. The waiting room was empty except for a gray-haired woman knitting in the corner and a young miner holding a bloody rag to his hand. Noel took a seat on the wooden bench and tried to organize his thoughts. How did a man explain that a tumor had burst and produced silver instead of infection? How did he describe the impossible healing that had followed Noel Boon? The voice belonged to Doc Harrison himself, a thin, balding man in his 50s who wore wire-rimmed spectacles and carried himself with the practiced calm of someone who'd seen every variety of human misery the mountains could produce. He gestured toward his office with one ink-stained hand. "Come on back. What seems to be the trouble this time?" Noel followed him into the familiar, cramped space that smelled of carbolic acid and whiskey. Medical instruments gleamed on a tray beside the examination table, and anatomical charts covered the walls like windows into the machinery of mortality. "It's my arm," Noel began, then stopped. How could he possibly explain, "Let's have a look"? Harrison was already reaching for his stethoscope. "Which arm? Roll up your sleeve." "That's just it, Doc. The problem, it's gone." Harrison paused, his eyebrows rising above his spectacles. "Gone? I had a tumor right here." Noel touched his left arm where the swelling had been. "Growing for weeks. Hurt like hell, kept me up nights. But this morning, on the trail, it burst." Burst. Harrison's voice carried the careful neutrality of a man who'd learned not to judge his patient's stories too quickly. "Show me." Noel rolled up his sleeve, revealing the unmarked skin. Harrison examined it with professional thoroughness, pressing and probing with gentle fingers that seemed to map every inch of flesh. "I don't see any sign of trauma," he said finally. "No scarring, no discoloration. Are you certain the location was here?" "Positive. I've been nursing the damn thing for 3 weeks." Harrison stepped back, removing his spectacles to clean them with a piece of cloth. "Sometimes what we think are tumors turn out to be simple cysts or abscesses. They can disappear on their own, especially if they drain naturally. This didn't drain, Doc. It produced something else." "What kind of something else?" Noel hesitated, his hand moving instinctively toward his coat pocket. The silver seemed to pulse against his palm, warm and insistent. Something impossible. Harrison replaced his spectacles and fixed Noel with a steady gaze. "Son, I've been practicing medicine in mining country for 15 years. I've seen men survive cave-ins that should have crushed them flat, and I've seen others die from scratches that turned septic. I've pulled more foreign objects out of human bodies than you could fit in a wagon, and I've watched supposedly incurable diseases vanish overnight for no reason anyone could explain. In this business, impossible is just another word for not yet understood." The kindness in the old doctor's voice broke through Noel's resistance. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the silver sphere, placing it on Harrison's examination table, where it caught the light from the window, and threw it back in brilliant cascades. Harrison stared at the object for a long moment, then picked it up with the careful reverence of a man handling something sacred. He held it up to the light, turned it over in his palm, even brought it close to his nose as if trying to detect some telltale odor. "This came from your arm?" he asked quietly. "Yes, sir." "How?" "I wish I knew. 1 minute I was pressing on the tumor trying to ease the pain. The next minute it burst open and this fell out. No blood, no pus, nothing but this." Harrison set the silver down and picked up a jeweler's loupe from his desk drawer. He spent several minutes examining the sphere under magnification, occasionally making soft sounds of amazement or puzzlement. "It's definitely silver," he said finally, "and it's purer than anything I've ever seen come out of these mountains. The surface is perfectly smooth, no tool marks or casting imperfections. It's almost as if it grew rather than being manufactured." "Is that possible?" "According to everything I learned in medical school, no. According to everything I've seen in 20 years of frontier practice." Harrison shrugged. "I've stopped being surprised by what the human body can do when it sets its mind to it." He handed the silver back to Noel, who slipped it into his pocket with relief. For a few minutes there, he'd been afraid the doctor would want to keep it for study, or worse, declare him insane and have him committed to the territorial asylum in Pueblo. "What happens now?" Noel asked. "Now you go home and count your blessings. Whatever caused that tumor is gone and you're left with what appears to be a rather valuable piece of silver. I'd say you came out ahead." "And if it happens again," Harrison considered this carefully, "do you feel any other growths, any unusual sensations?" Noel took inventory of his body, probing with his fingers for any hint of abnormality. "No, everything feels normal. Better than normal, actually. Stronger." "Then I'd say you're probably in the clear, but if anything else develops, anything at all, come see me immediately." And Noel, "Yes, sir. I'd keep this story to yourself." People in a mining town get funny ideas when they hear about silver appearing in unusual places. You don't want to attract the wrong kind of attention. Noel nodded, understanding the wisdom in those words. He'd seen what gold fever could do to supposedly rational men, the violence, the betrayal, the willingness to kill for even the rumor of easy wealth. If word got out that he was somehow producing silver from his own body. "Thanks, Doc. What do I owe you?" "Nothing. Call it professional curiosity." Harrison walked him to the door. "Take care of yourself, Noel. And if you figure out how you did that trick, you let me know. I've got a few patients who could use some impossible healing of their own." Outside, the afternoon sun had begun its descent toward the western peaks, painting the snow-covered mountains in shades of gold and rose. Noel stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the brightness and trying to process everything that had happened. The silver in his pocket seemed heavier now, weighted with possibility and danger in equal measure. Doc Harrison was right. He needed to keep this secret, but he also needed to understand what it meant. Why had this happened to him? Was it connected to his years of solitary mining, breathing in silver dust, and handling ore with his bare hands, or was it something else entirely, something that reached back to that terrible night 20 years ago, when he'd destroyed his family and fled into the wilderness? He was so lost in thought that he almost missed the familiar figure emerging from the land office across the street. The woman was older now, her auburn hair showing threads of silver and her face marked by years of hardship, but there was no mistaking those green eyes or the proud way she carried herself despite the patches on her worn coat. Kim Boon, his brother's widow, the woman who had every reason to hate him, and probably did. For a moment their eyes met across the busy street. Noel saw recognition dawn in her expression, followed immediately by something harder and colder than the mountain wind. She clutched a roll of papers to her chest, legal documents of some kind, and for a heartbeat he thought she might cross the street to confront him. Instead, she turned away and hurried down the sidewalk, disappearing into the crowd of miners and merchants that thronged Leadville's main thoroughfare. But not before Noel caught a glimpse of something in her face that cut deeper than a hatred, desperation. The silver in his pocket pulsed once sharply, as if responding to his emotional turmoil. And in that moment, Noel Boon realized that whatever miracle or curse had been visited upon him, it was only the beginning. The real test lay ahead, in confronting the ghosts of his past and deciding whether his impossible gift was meant to be hoarded or shared. The sun continued its descent and the shadows of the mountains grew longer. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed through the valley, the sound of progress and change rolling inexorably toward Leadville like a storm front heavy with lightning. Noel pulled his coat tighter around himself and began the long walk back to his mountain cabin, but he knew with cold certainty that he wouldn't be hiding in the peaks much longer. The silver had changed everything, and change, as any miner could tell you, was the one force in the world that couldn't be stopped once it started flowing. As he reached the edge of town, Noel turned for one last look at the bustling streets and smoke-stained buildings. Somewhere among those crowds, Kim Boon was fighting her own battles, carrying her own burdens. The papers she'd been clutching suggested legal troubles, probably something to do with the farm David had left her, the small spread of land northeast of town, where she was trying to raise 3 children alone. The decent thing would be to help her, if help was needed. The silver in his pocket could solve a lot of problems, could ease a lot of suffering, but helping Kim meant revealing himself, meant confronting the terrible thing he'd done to her husband, his brother, on that blood-soaked night 2 decades past. And it meant risking the exposure Doc Harrison had warned him about. Once people knew about the silver, there would be no peace, no safety, no quiet retreat to his mountain sanctuary. There would only be greed and violence and the kind of attention that destroyed everything it touched. But as Noel began the long climb back toward his cabin, the silver seemed to burn against his leg like a conscience made manifest. Some gifts, he was beginning to understand, came with obligations. Some miracles demanded courage rather than gratitude. The first stars were appearing in the deepening sky when he finally reached his small cabin tucked into a grove of pines halfway up the mountainside. It was a simple structure, one room with a stone fireplace, a sleeping loft, and windows that looked out over the valley where Leadville sparkled like scattered diamonds in the darkness. He'd built it with his own hands, log by log and stone by stone, creating a refuge where he could hide from the world and the memories that haunted him. But tonight, for the first time in 20 years, the cabin felt like a prison. Noel built up the fire and heated a can of beans for his supper, but the food tasted like ashes in his mouth. The silver sat on his rough-hewn table, catching the firelight and throwing it back in patterns that hurt his eyes to follow. He'd wrapped it in a piece of cloth, but even hidden from view, it dominated the small space like some slumbering predator that might wake at any moment. Outside, the wind had picked up, setting the pine boughs to creaking and sighing around the cabin. It was a sound he'd found comforting for 2 decades, but tonight it sounded like voices, urgent whispers carrying messages he couldn't quite make out. He found himself straining to listen, convinced that if he concentrated hard enough, he might understand what they were trying to tell him. It was past midnight when he finally gave up on sleep and returned to the table where the silver waited. He unwrapped it carefully, half expecting it to have changed, somehow perhaps grown larger or developed new characteristics. But it looked exactly the same, perfectly round, mirror bright and warm to the touch, despite the cabin's chill. "What are you?" he whispered to it, and was startled when his own voice seemed to echo strangely in the small space. "What do you want from me?" The silver, of course, didn't answer, but as Noel held it up to the firelight, he could swear he saw images moving in its polished surface, fleeting glimpses of scenes that might have been memories or prophecies or something else entirely. A woman's face streaked with tears, children huddled in the dark, men in expensive suits gathered around a table, their expressions cold and calculating. And through it all, the persistent image of railroad tracks stretching endlessly across the Colorado landscape, steel rails that would carry progress and prosperity to some while crushing everything that stood in their path. Noel wrapped the silver again and placed it in the wooden box where he kept his few precious possessions. His brother's war medal, a photograph of their parents taken before the consumption claimed them, and a letter he'd never had the courage to send. But even hidden away, he could feel its presence like a weight on his chest, pressing down with the accumulated force of 20 years' worth of guilt and regret. Tomorrow he decided he would go back to town, not to hide in the shadows and avoid difficult conversations, but to face whatever was coming head-on. The silver had found him for a reason, and that reason seemed to be pointing him toward Kim Boon and whatever troubles she was facing. It might mean the end of his peaceful exile. It might mean confronting truths he'd spent 2 decades trying to forget. But as Noel finally drifted off to sleep in his narrow bed, he knew that some gifts came with a price that had to be paid in courage rather than coin. The silver pulsed once more in its wooden box, a gentle warmth that seemed almost like approval. And in his dreams, Noel saw silver rivers flowing through mountain valleys, carrying hope and healing to places where both had been in short supply for far too long. But he also saw dark clouds gathering on the horizon, heavy with the promise of storms that would test every ounce of strength and determination he possessed. The miracle was only the beginning. The real test was about to begin. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Noel made his way back down the mountain trail, the silver secure in his coat pocket, but his mind churning with uncertainty. He'd barely slept, haunted by visions that seemed to dance between dream and prophecy, and now every step toward Leadville felt like walking toward a precipice he couldn't see but knew was there. The land office stood on Harrison Avenue, a modest brick building that served as the bureaucratic heart of the territory's mining claims and property disputes. Noel had avoided the place for 20 years, having no need for official papers or legal entanglements in his hermit's existence. But something about the desperate look in Kim's eyes yesterday, the way she'd clutched those documents to her chest, told him that whatever brought her there wasn't good news. He positioned himself across the street, leaning against a hitching post, with the practiced invisibility of a man who'd spent decades avoiding notice. The morning rush was in full swing, miners heading to their claims, merchants opening their shops, and the constant stream of wagons carrying ore to the smelters. The noise and bustle provided perfect cover for surveillance. It was nearly 10 o'clock when Kim emerged from the building, and this time Noel could see her face clearly. The desperation he'd glimpsed yesterday had deepened into something approaching panic. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the papers, and he could see tear tracks on her cheeks, even from across the busy street. Behind her came a man in an expensive suit, tall, well-fed, with the kind of manicured appearance that spoke of Eastern money and corporate power. He was saying something to Kim, his voice too low to carry over the street noise, but his body language was unmistakably threatening. When she tried to walk away, he grabbed her arm, spinning her around to face him. The silver in Noel's pocket suddenly blazed with heat, as if responding to his surge of protective anger. Without conscious thought, he found himself crossing the street, his mountain man's stride carrying him through the traffic with surprising grace for such a large man. "Final notice, Mrs. Boon," the suited man was saying as Noel approached. "The railroad's claim takes precedence under federal law. You have 30 days to vacate the property or will be forced to take action. That farm has been in my husband's family for 15 years. Kim shot back, her voice tight with controlled fury. "We have papers, legal title, which are superseded by the Pacific Mountain Railroad's congressional charter." The man interrupted smoothly. "I understand your distress, but progress waits for no one. The railroad must go through." That's when Noel stepped into their conversation like a force of nature. "Ma'am," he said quietly, touching the brim of his hat, "is this gentleman bothering you?" The railroad man turned, taking in Noel's weathered face and powerful frame with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to sizing up potential threats. "This is a private conversation, friend. I suggest you move along." "I wasn't talking to you," Noel replied, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from 20 years of surviving in the wilderness. His eyes never left Kim's face. "Ma'am." Kim stared at him for a long moment, recognition and old pain warring in her green eyes. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Noel." "Yes, ma'am. And you're Mrs. Boon." The formal address felt strange on his tongue, but necessary. Too much history lay between them for casual familiarity. The railroad man's eyes sharpened with interest. "Boon, another family member. How convenient. Perhaps you can talk some sense into your relative here. The railroad's offer is generous, more than fair market value for undeveloped land." "What railroad?" Noel asked, though he was beginning to understand the scope of the problem. "Pacific Mountain Railroad, incorporated under federal charter to connect Denver with the silver fields of the San Juan Mountains. The route requires a corridor through Mrs. Boon's property, and federal law grants us the right of eminent domain." "Over my dead body," Kim said fiercely. The railroad man smiled, and there was something predatory in the expression. "That can be arranged, Mrs. Boon. Frontier life is dangerous after all. Accidents happen." The silver in Noel's pocket suddenly felt like molten metal against his leg. The threat was unmistakable, and the casual way this well-dressed vulture had delivered it made Noel's hands clench into fists. He took a step forward, and something in his face made the railroad man retreat slightly. "What's your name?" Noel asked quietly. "Cornelius Blackwood, Chief Acquisitions Officer for Pacific Mountain Railroad. And you are someone who doesn't take kindly to threats against women and children." Blackwood's smile widened. "How chivalrous. But this is a matter of federal law, not frontier justice. The railroad will have that land, Mr. Boon, one way or another. The only question is whether you're relative will accept our generous compensation or force us to take more direct action." He tipped his hat mockingly and walked away, his expensive boots clicking on the wooden sidewalk. Noel watched him go, memorizing every detail of the man's appearance and bearing. Men like Blackwood were dangerous precisely because they hid their cruelty behind legal documents and corporate charters. "Why?" Kim asked suddenly, her voice raw with emotion. "Why are you here? Why now?" Noel turned back to face her, seeing the same beautiful woman his brother had married, but marked now by years of hardship and loss. "I saw you yesterday outside the land office. You looked troubled." "Troubled," she laughed bitterly. "That's one word for it. David's farm, our farm, is apparently sitting on the only viable route for their precious railroad. They want to tear down everything we've built, everything he died for, and they're offering pennies on the dollar for the privilege." "David died for that farm." Something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, maybe, or confusion. "You don't know. Of course you don't know. You disappeared that night and never looked back, never even came to the funeral." The accusation hit him like a physical blow. "Kim, I couldn't what? Face what you'd done. Face the family you destroyed." Her voice was rising now, drawing curious glances from passers-by. "He died in a mining accident 3 years later, Noel. Crushed in a cave-in while trying to earn enough money to keep the farm running. And I've been fighting to hold on to it ever since, raising our children, alone wondering if you were even alive." "Our children, David's children. Though I suppose they're your niece and nephews, if blood means anything to you anymore." The weight of 20 years' worth of guilt settled on Noel's shoulders like a lead blanket. "How many children?" "3. Mary's 16 now, Thomas is 14, and little Joseph just turned 10. They've never even heard your name because I couldn't bear to tell them about the uncle who killed their father and ran away into the mountains." Each word was a knife thrust precisely placed for maximum damage. But Noel forced himself to stand there and take it, knowing he deserved every accusation, every ounce of her pain and anger. "I know what I did," he said quietly. "I know I can never make it right, but if there's a way I can help you now, help me." Kim's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Where were you when I was pregnant and alone? Where were you when David was working himself to death, trying to prove he was man enough to replace the brother he'd lost? Where were you when I was delivering babies by lamplight because I couldn't afford a doctor?" "I was living with what I'd done," Noel replied simply. "Every day for 20 years. Something in his tone must have reached her because her anger flickered momentarily, replaced by something that might have been curiosity. "And what exactly have you been doing up there, Noel, besides hiding from your responsibilities?" He couldn't tell her about the silver, not here, not in public, not when he was still trying to understand what it meant, but he could tell her part of the truth. "Mining, mostly. Small claims, nothing worth talking about. I've got some money saved if you need help fighting the railroad." "Money won't stop them," Kim said, but some of the fire had gone out of her voice. Blackwood made that clear. They have federal backing, congressional charters, the full weight of the law behind them. What they don't have, they'll take by force. There has to be something, some legal recourse. Kim held up the papers she'd been clutching. "According to the territorial court, my title is valid under Colorado law, but federal law supersedes territorial law, and the railroad's congressional charter gives them the right to seize any land they need for their route. Unless I can prove the land is already under federal protection. Sacred Indian burial grounds, military reservation, something like that. But our farm is just a farm, Noel. Wheat fields and grazing land and a little house where 3 children sleep in beds their father built with his own hands." The desperation in her voice cut through his guilt like a blade. Here was a woman fighting impossible odds to protect everything she had left, and he was probably the only person in the territory who could help her. The irony wasn't lost on him. The brother who'd destroyed her life might be the only one who could save what remained of it. There might be another way. he said carefully. What do you mean? I need to do some research first. Check some old territorial surveys, look into the history of your land grant. But Kim, if I find something, if there's a way to stop this, will you let me help? She studied his face for a long moment, her green eyes searching for something he wasn't sure he possessed anymore. Trustworthiness, perhaps, or simple human decency. Why would you do that? She asked finally. Because it's the right thing to do, and because I owe you a debt I can never repay. You owe me more than a debt, Noel Boon. You owe me a brother-in-law who should have been there when my children needed an uncle. You owe me a husband who might have lived longer if he hadn't been trying so hard to fill the hole you left behind. The truth of her words settled in his chest like a stone. I know, and I know I can't bring David back or give you those 20 years, but I can try to save your farm. Kim was quiet for a long time, watching the traffic flow around them. Miners and merchants, cowboys and city folk, all the human debris of a territory caught between its wild past and its civilized future. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than it had been since she'd recognized him. The children don't know about you, about what happened that night. I told them their father had a brother who died in the war. Maybe that's for the best. Maybe. But if you're serious about helping, if you're really going to try to fight the railroad, they'll find out eventually. Leadville's too small for secrets, especially ones involving the Boon family. I understand. Do you understand that if you fail, if the railroad takes our land anyway, you'll have given them hope for nothing? Do you understand that these children have already lost their father and they can't afford to lose their home too? The weight of her expectations settled on him like a physical burden, but the silver in his pocket pulsed with warmth, as if encouraging him to take on this impossible task. I understand, he said simply, and I won't fail. Kim studied him for another moment, then nodded once curtly. I'm staying at the Miners' Rest boarding house on State Street, room 12. If you find something, anything that might help, you can reach me there. But Noel, yes, don't make promises you can't keep. I've had enough disappointment for one lifetime. She walked away before he could respond, her spine straight and her head held high despite the impossible burden she was carrying. Noel watched her go, understanding for the first time the full scope of what his moment of violence 20 years ago had cost not just David's life, but the ripple effects that had spread outward like cracks in ice, touching everyone in their family circle. But dwelling on past failures wouldn't solve present problems. He had work to do. The territorial courthouse occupied a grand building on West 6th Street, its brick facade and classical columns a monument to law and order in a land that had known precious little of either. Noel climbed the steps with growing determination, the silver in his pocket seeming to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. The records office was a dusty, cramped space filled with filing cabinets and map cases that contained the official history of Colorado Territory's land grants and mining claims. A bored-looking clerk directed him to the appropriate section, and Noel spent the next 3 hours poring over territorial surveys and federal documents, trying to piece together the legal history of Kim's farm. What he found was both encouraging and troubling. The original land grant dated back to 1872, when David had filed his homestead claim under the provisions of the Federal Homestead Act. The documentation appeared to be in order. David had fulfilled his 5-year residency requirement, improved the land as specified by law, and received clear title from the territorial government. But there was something else buried in the fine print of earlier territorial surveys. The farm sat adjacent to a section of land that had been set aside in 1868 under a treaty with the Ute Nation, a buffer zone meant to prevent conflicts between white settlers and the local tribes. The boundary descriptions were frustratingly vague, using landmarks that might or might not still exist. But it was possible that part of Kim's property actually fell within the treaty zone. If that were true, it would complicate the railroad's claims considerably. Federal law might supersede territorial law, but it couldn't supersede existing treaties with sovereign Indian nations. The railroad would need permission from the Ute Council to build through treaty lands, and such permission was notoriously difficult to obtain. But proving the boundary overlap would require a professional survey, and that would take time they didn't have. Blackwood had given Kim 30 days to vacate, and nearly one of those days was already gone. Noel was still puzzling over the maps when a shadow fell across his table. He looked up to see a man of perhaps 60 years, lean and weathered with the kind of deep tan that came from decades of outdoor work. His clothes were a mixture of white and Indian styles, denim pants and cotton shirt, but with beaded moccasins and a silver bracelet that caught the afternoon light streaming through the courthouse windows. "You're looking at treaty maps." The man observed, his voice carrying only the faintest trace of an accent. "Yes, sir. Are you familiar with the 1868 Ute boundaries?" The man's weathered face cracked into what might have been a smile. "I should be. I helped negotiate them. Henry Littlefeather Ute Nation Council." Noel stood, quickly extending his hand. "Noel Boon. I'm trying to help a friend with a land dispute." Henry's grip was firm and calloused, the handshake of a man who'd worked with his hands all his life. "Boon, that name's familiar. You related to David Boon, had the farm northeast of town. He was my brother." "Good man David, treated the Ute fairly when most whites wouldn't give us the time of day. I was sorry to hear about his accident." Henry paused, studying Noel's face with dark eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. "But you weren't at the funeral." "No, sir, I wasn't." "Mind if I ask why?" The question was asked without judgment, but Noel could feel the weight of evaluation behind it. Henry Littlefeather was clearly a man who measured others by their actions rather than their words. "Personal reasons," Noel said carefully. "Family trouble." Henry nodded as if this explained everything. "Family trouble's the worst kind. Cuts deeper than enemy bullets, heals slower than winter wounds." He gestured toward the maps spread across the table. "What kind of land dispute brings you to treaty boundaries?" Noel explained about the railroad's claim, Blackwood's threats, and Kim's desperate situation. Henry listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or asking a clarifying question. When Noel finished, the older man was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes distant with thought. "Pacific Mountain Railroad," Henry said finally. "We've been watching them. They want to build through the San Juan Mountains, straight through the heart of our sacred lands. The railroad executives think they can buy or intimidate their way past any obstacle, including treaty rights. Can they? Not legally. The 1868 treaty is still valid, still enforceable under federal law, but legal and actual are two different things in frontier territory. They've been pressuring Washington to renegotiate or void the treaty entirely. What about the boundary question? Does Kim's farm fall within the treaty zone?" Henry moved to the table and studied the maps with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading terrain. His finger traced the boundary descriptions following the vague geographical markers that 19th century surveyors had used to define territorial limits. "Possible," he said after several minutes. The eastern boundary was defined as the ridge line visible from Sleeping Bear Rock to the confluence of Miller's Creek and the Arkansas River. If that farm sits on the eastern slope of that ridge, then it's treaty land. "Protected treaty land," Henry corrected. "Land the railroad can't touch without our explicit permission." "And would you give that permission?" Henry's smile was sharp as a blade. "What do you think?" Hope flared in Noel's chest like a struck match. "How do we prove the boundary overlap? Professional survey would take weeks, maybe months. But there's another way." Henry tapped the map with one weathered finger. "Sleeping Bear Rock is a sacred site. My grandfather's grandfather is buried there, along with chiefs going back 7 generations. I know every stone, every tree, every blade of grass within a day's ride of that place. You could verify the boundaries personally. I could do more than that. I could take you there, show you the markers the surveyors used, help you document the boundary overlap. But it would have to be soon. That 30-day deadline doesn't give us much time to work with. When? Tomorrow, if you're willing. But I should warn you, it's not an easy ride, especially this time of year, and if the railroad finds out what we're doing, they'll try to stop us. They'll do more than try. Blackwood's the kind of man who believes problems are best solved with bullets rather than lawyers. You prepared for that kind of trouble. Noel thought about the silver in his pocket, about Kim's desperate face, about 20 years of guilt and isolation that had brought him to this moment. I'm prepared. Henry studied him for another long moment, then nodded approvingly. Meet me at the livery stable on Harrison Avenue at dawn. Bring warm clothes and a rifle. We'll be camping overnight, and there are worse things than cold weather in those mountains. What worse things? Railroad men who don't want witnesses to what they're planning. Henry gathered up the maps and returned them to their proper files. David Boon was a good man, Mr. Boon. He deserved better than what happened to him. Maybe his brother can finish what he started. The words hit Noel like a physical blow, carrying implications he wasn't ready to examine. Henry Littlefeather clearly knew more about the Boon family history than he was letting on, but there would be time for difficult conversations later. Right now, Kim and her children were facing eviction, and every hour counted. As he left the courthouse, the late afternoon sun was painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The silver in his pocket felt warm against his leg, pulsing gently, as if approving of the path he'd chosen. Tomorrow he would ride into those mountains with a Ute elder, searching for proof that might save Kim's farm and children's future. But tonight he had other preparations to make. If Blackwood was as dangerous as Henry suggested, this mission would require more than legal documents and treaty rights. It would require the kind of frontier justice that civilized men preferred to pretend didn't exist. Noel Boon had spent 20 years running from violence, hiding in the mountains to avoid the consequences of one terrible night's bloodshed. But some fights couldn't be avoided, and some debts could only be paid in kind. The silver pulsed once more in his pocket, warm and insistent, as if reminding him that miracles came with obligations. And sometimes those obligations required a man to stand and fight regardless of the cost. The sun disappeared behind the western peaks as Noel made his way through Leadville's crowded streets, already planning for tomorrow's journey into the heart of treaty lands where the past and future would collide in ways none of them could imagine. Dawn came pale and cold over the Colorado peaks, the sky the color of old pewter as Noel made his way through Leadville's empty streets toward the livery stable. His breath misted in the frigid air, and frost covered every surface like nature's attempt to preserve the world in crystal. The silver in his pocket had grown warm during the night, pulsing gently against his leg as if it too sensed the importance of the day ahead. Henry Littlefeather was already waiting when Noel arrived, standing beside two sturdy mountain horses that had been saddled and provisioned for the journey. The Ute elder wore practical trail clothes and a heavy coat, but Noel noticed the ceremonial knife at his belt and the small leather pouch that probably contained sacred items. This wasn't just a surveying expedition for Henry, it was a pilgrimage to ancestral lands. "You brought the rifle?" Henry asked, nodding toward the Winchester .44-40 slung across Noel's shoulder. "And enough ammunition for a small war if it comes to that. Let's hope it doesn't. But hope and preparation are two different things." Henry swung into his saddle with the easy grace of a man who'd been riding before he could walk. "We'll follow the old trail north, then cut east through Devil's Canyon. Should reach Sleeping Bear Rock by late afternoon." They rode out of Leadville as the town was beginning to stir past the early rising miners heading to their claims and the merchants opening their shops for another day of commerce. Noel found himself looking for Kim's face among the few pedestrians on the streets, but the boarding house windows remained dark. She was probably still asleep, unaware that her fate might be decided in the mountains above. The trail north wound through increasingly rugged terrain, following a path that had been used by Ute hunting parties for generations before white men ever dreamed of Colorado silver. Henry rode in comfortable silence for the first hour, apparently content to let the horses find their rhythm and the morning sun burn off the valley fog. It was Noel who finally broke the quiet. "You knew my brother well." "Well enough. David would ride out to the reservation, sometimes trade for horses, or just to talk. Not many white men bothered to learn our language or understand our customs. David did both." "That sounds like him. He always saw the best in people." Henry glanced sideways at Noel, his dark eyes thoughtful. "Even in you." The question hit harder than expected. "Especially in me, which is why what I did to him was so unforgivable." Henry finished when Noel's voice trailed off. "Yes. You want to tell me what happened that night?" Noel was quiet for a long moment, listening to the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats on frozen ground and the whisper of wind through pine branches. He'd never told the story to anyone, had carried it alone for 20 years, like a weight that grew heavier with each passing day. "We were both drinking," he said finally, "more than we should have been. David had just gotten married to Kim, was talking about starting a family, building up the farm. I was jealous, I guess. Jealous that he'd found happiness while I was still drifting from claim to claim, never settling anywhere long enough to build anything worthwhile." Henry listened without comment, his weathered face revealing nothing. "We started arguing about money. David wanted to expand the farm, needed capital to buy more land, better equipment. He asked me to go in with him as a partner, said we could work the land together like we used to work our father's farm back in Missouri. But you said no." "I said worse than no. I said he was a fool for thinking he could make a living farming in mining country. Said Kim would leave him the first time things got rough, that she was too pretty and too young to waste her life on a dirt farmer with big dreams and small prospects." The memory burned in Noel's throat like swallowed acid. Even after 20 years, he could still see David's face, the hurt, the disappointment, the growing anger as his older brother systematically destroyed every hope and dream he'd shared. "David hit me," Noel continued, "son. Not hard, just a backhanded slap to shut me up. But I was drunk and angry and 20 years old, and I hit him back. Hard enough to send him stumbling backward into the corner where I kept my rifle." Henry's horse snorted and shied at something in the undergrowth, but the Ute elder controlled it easily, his attention never wavering from Noel's story. "The rifle went off when David fell against it. Pure accident, 1,000,000 to 1 chance that the hammer would strike just right to fire the cartridge. But the bullet," Noel's voice broke, "the bullet caught him in the chest, just below the heart. He looked at me with such surprise, like he couldn't believe what was happening, and then he just collapsed." "Did you try to help him?" "I tried everything. Pressure on the wound, tried to carry him to town for a doctor, but it was winter, the trail was blocked by snow, and he was bleeding too fast. He died in my arms about an hour after the shot, and his last words were asking me to take care of Kim and the baby she was carrying." "But you didn't." I panicked. Realized that when people found David's body, they'd see the bullet hole and assume I'd murdered him in cold blood. The truth that it was a drunken accident wouldn't matter to a lynch mob. So I buried him in an unmarked grave up on the mountain, packed my gear, and disappeared into the wilderness. Henry was quiet for a long time, processing the story and its implications. When he finally spoke, his voice carried neither judgment nor sympathy. Just the measured tone of a man who'd seen enough of human nature to understand its complexities. "Kim never knew the truth. I let her believe I'd killed him deliberately. Thought it would be easier for her to hate me than to know she'd lost her husband to a stupid accident that could have been avoided if I'd just kept my mouth shut. And you've been carrying that guilt for 20 years. Every day, every night. It's why I stayed in the mountains, why I never tried to contact the family. I figured the damage was done and staying away was the only gift I could give them." Henry reined in his horse at the top of a ridge, looking out over a vista of snow-covered peaks that stretched to the horizon like frozen waves. "You know what I think, Noel Boon?" "What's that?" "I think you're a coward." The blunt assessment hit Noel like a physical blow. He started to protest, but Henry held up a hand for silence. "Not for what happened that night. Young men do stupid things when they're drunk and angry. That's been true since the beginning of time. You're a coward for what you did afterward, for deciding that your guilt was more important than Kim's need to know the truth, for choosing the easy path of exile over the hard work of making amends. I couldn't bring David back." "No, but you could have helped his widow raise his children. You could have worked his farm, kept his dream alive, been the brother he asked you to be in his dying words. Instead, you hid in the mountains feeling sorry for yourself while Kim struggled alone." The truth of it burned in Noel's chest like molten metal. "You're right. Of course I'm right. The question is, what are you going to do about it now?" Before Noel could answer, Henry suddenly stiffened in his saddle, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle scabbarded beside his leg. "We're being followed." Noel looked back along the trail they'd traveled, scanning the tree line for signs of pursuit. At first, he saw nothing, but then sunlight flashed off something metallic in the distance, probably the barrel of a rifle or the brass fittings on a saddle. "How many?" Noel asked quietly. "3, maybe 4. They've been hanging back about a mile, trying to stay out of sight. Professional work." "Blackwood's men." "Most likely. The railroad doesn't like surprises, and our little research expedition probably has them worried." Henry spurred his horse forward, picking up the pace, but not enough to signal panic to their pursuers. "There's a place up ahead where we can lose them, but it means taking the dangerous route through Devil's Canyon." "How dangerous?" "Dangerous enough that most men wouldn't follow even for railroad money. Narrow ledges, loose rock, 100-foot drop if your horse makes a wrong step. And if they do follow..." Henry's smile was sharp as winter wind. "Then we'll be fighting on ground I've known since childhood, against men who'll be more worried about falling to their deaths than aiming their rifles." They rode in tense silence for another hour, gradually climbing higher into the mountains as the trail wound through stands of aspen and pine. The air grew thinner and colder, and their horses' breath came in white puffs that dissipated quickly in the dry mountain air. Behind them, their pursuers maintained their distance, but showed no signs of giving up the chase. Devil's Canyon announced itself with a sudden narrowing of the trail and a precipitous drop on the right side that seemed to plunge straight down into hell itself. The path was barely wide enough for a single horse carved into the cliff face by centuries of wind and water erosion. One wrong step would send horse and rider tumbling into a rocky abyss. "Stay close," Henry warned as they began the treacherous descent. "Follow my exact path, and whatever you do, don't look down." The next 30 minutes were the longest of Noel's life. His horse picked its way carefully along the narrow ledge, occasionally sending loose stones clattering into the void below. The silver in his pocket seemed to grow heavier with each step, as if it too understood the precarious nature of their situation. They were halfway through the canyon when the shooting started. The first rifle shot echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, followed immediately by the whine of a bullet ricocheting off the rock face inches from Noel's head. Their pursuers had reached the canyon entrance and were trying to pick them off from above. "Move!" Henry shouted, spurring his horse into the dangerous middle ground between speed and safety. More shots followed, some striking the cliff face near them, others sailing harmlessly into the abyss. The railroad men were good shots, but the angle was difficult and their targets were moving. Still, it was only a matter of time before luck or skill sent a bullet home. That's when the silver in Noel's pocket began to burn. Not the gentle warmth he'd grown accustomed to, but searing heat that felt like a brand pressed against his flesh. The sensation was so intense that he gasped aloud, nearly losing his seat as his horse navigated a particularly treacherous section of the trail. But with the burning came something else, a sudden clarity of vision that seemed to slow time itself. He could see the muzzle flashes from the rifles above, could track the trajectory of each bullet as if it were moving through molasses rather than air. More importantly, he could see exactly where the shooters were positioned, their locations revealed as clearly as if they'd been outlined in silver fire. Without conscious thought, Noel drew his Winchester and fired 3 shots in rapid succession. Each bullet found its mark with impossible precision, not killing shots but wounding strikes that sent the railroad men scrambling for cover and ended their ambush as effectively as if he'd put them in their graves. "Incredible shooting!" Henry called out as they cleared the narrow section and reached a wider ledge where they could rest their horses. "I've never seen anyone fire that accurately from horseback on a moving trail." Noel stared at his rifle in amazement, hardly believing what had just happened. The silver had stopped burning and returned to its usual gentle warmth, but the memory of that enhanced perception lingered like an afterimage. "Lucky shots," he said weakly. Henry fixed him with a penetrating stare. "That wasn't luck, Noel Boon. That was something else entirely. Something you want to tell me about?" Before Noel could decide how to answer, the sound of horses echoing from the canyon walls announced that their pursuers weren't giving up. Wounded men might be more dangerous than healthy ones, especially when they were working for someone like Cornelius Blackwood. "We need to keep moving," Henry said. "Sleeping Bear Rock is still 2 hours ahead, and those men will find another way around the canyon eventually." They pressed on, climbing ever higher into the mountains as the sun reached its zenith and began its slow descent toward the western peaks. The trail was easier here, following ridge lines and natural saddles that provided good visibility in all directions. But that same visibility worked both ways. They could see their enemies, but their enemies could see them. It was mid-afternoon when they finally reached Sleeping Bear Rock, a massive granite formation that did indeed resemble a slumbering grizzly when viewed from the proper angle. The rock sat at the intersection of 3 valleys, a natural landmark that would have been visible to 19th century surveyors from miles away. Henry dismounted and approached the formation with obvious reverence, placing his weathered hand on the stone and speaking softly in the Ute language. When he finished, he began walking around the base of the rock, examining the ground with the practiced eye of someone reading an ancient text. "Here," he said, finally pointing to a series of carved symbols barely visible on the rock surface. "Survey markers from 1868, and there," he indicated a pile of stones arranged in a deliberate pattern, "the traditional boundary marker used by my people for generations." Noel dismounted and joined him, trying to understand what he was seeing. "What does it mean?" "It means the eastern boundary of the treaty zone runs right through that valley where your sister-in-law's farm sits. The railroad can't touch that land without permission from the Ute Council, and that permission will never come." Hope flared in Noel's chest, like a struck match. "You're certain?" "I helped place these markers myself as a young man. I know every stone, every symbol, every inch of this boundary. David Boone's farm is protected treaty land, and Kim has every right to stay there." "How do we prove it in court?" Henry was already pulling paper and charcoal from his saddlebags. "Documentation. I'll make rubbings of the survey markers, sketch the boundary stones, write a formal statement certifying the boundary location. It won't be as good as a professional survey, but it should be enough to force the railroad to back down, at least temporarily." As Henry worked, Noel kept watch for their pursuers. The silver in his pocket had begun pulsing again, not with heat, but with a rhythm that seemed to match his heartbeat. Something was coming, he could feel it in his bones, in the way the wind carried sounds that shouldn't have been there. "How much longer?" he asked quietly. 10 minutes, maybe 15. "Why?" "Because they're coming." Henry looked up from his documentation, scanning the surrounding peaks with experienced eyes. "Where?" "South Ridge. 3 men on foot probably left their horses at the canyon entrance and climbed up the back way." "You see them?" Noel started to say yes, then realized he couldn't actually see anything, but he knew they were there with absolute certainty, the same supernatural awareness that had guided his impossible shots in the canyon. The silver was doing something to him, enhancing his senses in ways that defied explanation. "I feel them," he said simply. Henry gave him another of those penetrating stares, but there was no time for questions. He quickly finished his documentation and packed everything safely in his saddlebags. "We need to reach the horses and get back to town. This evidence won't help Kim if we're both dead." They were mounting up when the first rifle shot cracked across the mountainside. This time the shooter was much closer, and his bullet shattered a piece of granite inches from Henry's head. The railroad men had reached Sleeping Bear Rock and were determined to eliminate the witnesses who could destroy their land grab. "This way," Henry shouted, spurring his horse toward a trail that led down the north face of the mountain. More shots followed as they rode bullets whining through the air around them like angry hornets. Their pursuers were on foot now, which limited their mobility but improved their accuracy. Noel could hear them shouting to each other, coordinating their attack with military precision. That's when he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Pulling his horse to a stop, Noel turned to face their attackers. The silver in his pocket was burning again, that same searing heat that had guided his shots in the canyon. But this time the sensation was stronger, more focused, as if 20 years of guilt and regret were being forged into something harder and more dangerous than mere metal. "Keep going," he shouted to Henry. "Get that evidence to Kim." "What are you doing?" "What I should have done 20 years ago, standing and fighting instead of running away." Noel dismounted and took cover behind a boulder, his Winchester ready, and his vision crystal clear despite the adrenaline flooding his system. He could see all three men now spread out among the rocks above him, their positions as obvious as if they'd been marked with flags. The first man broke cover to get a better shot angle. Noel's bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle flying into the rocks. The second man tried to flank him from the left, but the silver-enhanced perception allowed Noel to track his movement and put a round through his leg before he could reach position. The third man was smarter, staying behind cover and waiting for a clear shot, but he made the mistake of calling out to his wounded companions, and Noel used the sound to pinpoint his exact location. One shot through the gap between two boulders, and the ambush was over. None of the railroad men were dead, but all three were wounded badly enough to end their threat. Noel holstered his rifle and remounted his horse, the silver in his pocket, cooling to its normal, gentle warmth. Henry was waiting for him at the bottom of the trail, his dark eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and concern. "That was either the bravest or the stupidest thing I've ever seen a white man do." "Probably both," Noel admitted, "but those men won't be following us anymore." "No, but they'll report back to Blackwood. He'll know we have the evidence now." "Then we'd better get it to town before he can do anything about it." They rode hard for the next 2 hours, pushing their horses to the edge of endurance as they raced against time and the certainty that Cornelius Blackwood would not accept this setback quietly. The railroad had too much invested in their route through the valley to let treaty rights and legal documents stand in their way. The sun was setting behind the western peaks when they finally reached the outskirts of Leadville, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Noel of the fires that would soon be burning if Blackwood decided to solve his problems with violence instead of law. The silver in his pocket pulsed once gently, as if acknowledging that they'd won this battle, but warning that the war was far from over. As they rode into town, Noel could see smoke rising from the direction of Kim's boarding house. Not the normal chimney smoke of cooking fires or heating stoves, but the thick black smoke of something burning that wasn't meant to burn. Fear clenched his chest like a frozen fist. The boarding house. Henry saw it too. Blackwood sending a message. They spurred their tired horses toward State Street, racing against the spreading flames and the terrible certainty that Kim and her children were in mortal danger. The evidence in Henry's saddlebags could save her farm, but it wouldn't matter if there was no family left to save. The Miners' Rest boarding house was fully engulfed. When they arrived, flames shooting through the windows, and roof like demonic fingers reaching for the sky. A crowd had gathered to watch the conflagration, but no one was fighting the fire. The volunteer brigade's equipment was conspicuously absent, probably disabled or delayed by railroad money. Noel dismounted and grabbed the nearest spectator, a miner he recognized from previous trips to town. "The woman in room 12, Mrs. Boon, did she get out?" "Don't know," the man replied. "Fire started about an hour ago, spread real fast. Haven't seen nobody come out the front." Panic flooded Noel's system, washing away 20 years of carefully constructed emotional barriers. Kim and her children might be trapped in that inferno, dying while he stood helplessly in the street. The silver in his pocket began to burn again, but this time the heat spread through his entire body, filling him with strength and purpose that felt almost supernatural. Without conscious thought, he charged toward the burning building. "Noel, no," Henry shouted behind him. "It's too late." But it wasn't too late. It couldn't be too late. He'd failed Kim once by running away when she needed him most. He wouldn't fail her again, even if it meant dying in the flames that were consuming everything she had left in the world. The silver burned against his leg like a star fallen to earth, and Noel Boon ran toward the fire with the desperate courage of a man who'd finally found something worth dying for. The heat hit Noel like a physical wall as he burst through the boarding house's front door, the silver in his pocket blazing with such intensity that he could feel it through his coat, through his shirt burning against his skin like a brand. The main hallway was a tunnel of flame and smoke, the wallpaper peeling and curling as fire devoured everything in its path. Overhead the ceiling groaned ominously, beams sagging under the weight of burning timbers that threatened to collapse at any moment. "Kim!" he shouted, his voice barely audible above the roar of the inferno. "Kim, where are you?" The smoke was so thick he could barely see 3 feet ahead, but the silver seemed to be guiding him, its supernatural heat pulling him toward the back stairs that led to the second floor. Each step was an act of faith, trusting in an impossible miracle to lead him through hell itself. The wooden steps creaked dangerously under his weight, some of them already charred and weakened by the flames licking at their undersides. Halfway up, a burning beam crashed down behind him, cutting off his retreat and filling the stairwell with a shower of sparks that singed his hair and coat. There was no going back now, only forward toward whatever waited in the smoke-choked darkness above. Room 12 was at the far end of the hall, past doors that hung open like mouths screaming silent warnings. The fire hadn't reached this section yet, but smoke filled every inch of space, making breathing an exercise in controlled suffocation. Noel pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth, but it provided little protection against the toxic air. He reached Kim's door and found it locked. Kim, are you in there?" A faint sound came from within, not voices, but the scraping of furniture being moved. Someone was alive in there, but trapped. Noel threw his shoulder against the door, but the solid oak held firm. The silver in his pocket pulsed urgently, as if sensing time running out. "Stand back from the door," he shouted, then drew his pistol and put 2 bullets through the lock mechanism. The door swung open to reveal a scene that would haunt his dreams forever. Kim stood in the center of the small room, her face streaked with soot and tears, clutching a boy of perhaps 10 years to her chest. In the corner, a teenage girl knelt beside an unconscious figure, a boy slightly older than the first, his face pale and his breathing shallow. "Noel." Kim's voice was raw from smoke inhalation. "How did you—" "Questions later. We need to get out of here now." He moved to the unconscious boy, feeling for a pulse. The heartbeat was there, but weak, and the child's skin felt clammy to the touch. "What happened to him?" Thomas tried to fight the fire. The girl said, her voice steady, despite her obvious fear. "A beam fell and hit his head. He won't wake up." This had to be Mary David's daughter, with her father's steady courage and her mother's green eyes. The boy in Kim's arms would be Joseph, the youngest born after David's death, and never knowing his father except through stories. "Can he be moved?" Noel asked gently, examining Thomas's head wound. "I don't know. I'm not a doctor." "We don't have a choice. The fire's spreading fast, and this whole building is going to come down." Noel scooped Thomas into his arms, surprised by how light the boy felt. At 14, he should have been heavier, but frontier life and limited food had kept him small for his age. "Mary, take Joseph's other hand," Kim ordered. "Stay close to Mr. Boon and do exactly what he says." They made their way back toward the stairs, but one look down the stairwell showed that route was now completely blocked by fallen debris and roaring flames. The fire had consumed the lower floor and was climbing rapidly toward them, eating through the building's wooden bones like a ravenous beast. "The window," Mary said, pointing toward the single window that faced the alley behind the building. "There's a fire ladder the volunteers installed last year." Noel looked out and saw the iron ladder bolted to the brick wall, but his heart sank. The ladder only reached to the first floor. There was still a 12-foot drop from the second-story window to its top rung. With an unconscious boy in his arms and 2 other children to protect it, might as well have been 100 feet. That's when the silver in his pocket suddenly cooled, the burning sensation replaced by something else entirely, a feeling of weightlessness, as if gravity itself had loosened its hold on him. He looked down at Thomas's unconscious form and knew with absolute certainty that he could make the jump safely. "I'm going first, with Thomas," he told Kim. "Lower him down to me, then you and the others follow. The ladder will hold, I promise." "Noel, you can't possibly. Trust me." He climbed onto the windowsill, Thomas's limp form cradled in his arms. "I know it looks impossible, but I can do this." Without giving himself time to think about the insanity of what he was attempting, Noel jumped. The sensation was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Instead of the crushing impact he expected, he seemed to float downward like a feather on the wind, the silver in his pocket providing some impossible counterforce to gravity's pull. He landed on the fire ladder with barely ajar, Thomas still unconscious, but unharmed in his arms. Above him, Kim's face appeared in the window, her expression a mixture of amazement and terror. "How did you just drop Joseph down to me?" Noel called back. "I'll catch him." One by one, he helped them down first. Joseph, then Mary, and finally Kim herself. Each landing was as gentle as his own had been, the silver somehow extending its protective influence to anyone he was trying to save. By the time they reached the alley behind the building, the entire structure was engulfed in flames, the roof beginning to collapse in on itself with thunderous crashes that shook the ground beneath their feet. They had escaped just in time. "The doctor!" Kim gasped, looking down at Thomas's still form. "We need to get him to Doc Harrison." "I'll carry him," Noel said, but Kim shook her head. "You've done enough, more than enough." She was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Gratitude mixed with suspicion, as if she understood that what had just happened defied all natural law. "How did you do that, Noel? How did you jump from that window without killing yourself?" Before he could answer, Henry Littlefeather appeared at the mouth of the alley leading their horses and scanning the crowd of onlookers that had gathered to watch the fire. "Thank God you're alive. When I saw you run into that building..." "We need to get Thomas to a doctor," Noel said, avoiding Kim's question. "And then, we need to get somewhere safe. This wasn't an accident." "What do you mean?" Kim asked. "I mean Cornelius Blackwood set this fire to flush you out, to destroy any evidence that might protect your farm. He's declared war, Kim, and tonight was just the opening shot." As if summoned by his name, Blackwood himself emerged from the crowd of spectators, his expensive suit immaculate despite the chaos around them. He was flanked by 2 men Noel didn't recognize, hard-faced individuals with the look of professional killers about them. The railroad lawyer's smile was cold as winter wind. "Mrs. Boon," Blackwood said pleasantly, "how unfortunate that you've lost your lodgings. But perhaps this tragedy will help you see reason about my generous offer for your farm." You did this, Kim said, her voice shaking with rage. You burned down that building with children inside. I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about. Fires are tragically common in frontier towns. All those wooden buildings, poorly maintained chimneys, careless use of oil lamps. The territorial marshal will undoubtedly rule it an accident. Like hell he will. Noel stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. I know what you are, Blackwood. I know what you're capable of. And I know what you are, Mr. Boon, a mountain hermit with delusions of heroism. But heroics won't save Mrs. Boon's farm, and they certainly won't protect her children from future accidents. The threat was unmistakable, delivered with the casual confidence of a man who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. Noel felt the silver in his pocket begin to warm again, responding to his anger and the very real danger facing Kim's family. You want a war, Noel said quietly. You've got one. Blackwood's smile widened. Excellent. I was hoping you'd say that. It makes what comes next so much more satisfying. He nodded to his men, who began to advance with their hands resting on their gun butts. The crowd of onlookers suddenly found urgent business elsewhere, melting away with the practiced speed of people who'd learned to recognize trouble before it started shooting. But before the confrontation could escalate, Doc Harrison appeared with his medical bag, pushing through the dispersing crowd with the authority of a man whose services were needed regardless of politics. What's wrong with the boy? He demanded, taking in Thomas's unconscious state with professional concern. Head injury, Kim said quickly. A beam fell on him during the fire. Harrison knelt beside Thomas, checking his pulse and examining the wound with gentle hands. Concussion, but not too severe. He'll need watching for the next few days, but he should recover fully. Let's get him to my office. As the doctor prepared to move, Thomas Blackwood stepped closer to Kim, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she and Noel could hear. 30 days, Mrs. Boon. That was our agreement, but after tonight's complications, I'm afraid I'll have to revise that timeline. You have 1 week to vacate your property, or the next fire might not leave any survivors. Go to hell, Kim spat. Eventually, I'm sure, but not before I finish what I started here. Blackwood tipped his hat mockingly and walked away, his hired guns falling into step behind him like trained dogs. As they carried Thomas to Doc Harrison's office, Noel found himself walking beside Henry Littlefeather, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, but whose dark eyes had missed nothing. The evidence, Noel said quietly. Do we still have it? Henry patted his saddlebags. Safe and sound, but it won't matter if Blackwood kills everyone before we can get it to a judge. Then we need to move fast. How long will it take to get this to the territorial court? The circuit judge won't be back in Leadville for another 2 weeks, but there's a federal magistrate in Denver who has jurisdiction over treaty matters. If we can get this evidence to him. How long to reach Denver? 3 days hard riding, but Blackwood will try to stop us. He can't afford to let this evidence reach federal court. They had reached Doc Harrison's office, where the physician was already examining Thomas under better light. The boy's color was improving, and his breathing had steadied, but he remained unconscious. He'll live, Harrison announced after several minutes of careful examination. The skull isn't fractured, but he has a severe concussion. He needs absolute rest for at least a week. No excitement, no sudden movements. Doctor, Kim said desperately, we don't have a week. We don't even have a safe place to stay tonight. Harrison looked up from his patient, taking in the soot-stained faces and singed clothing that told their own story. You can use the back room here. It's not much, but it's secure and warm. But Mrs. Boon, that boy cannot be moved for several days. Any jarring or excitement could cause permanent damage. Noel felt the weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders. Thomas needed medical care and rest, but staying in Leadville made them sitting ducks for Blackwood's next attack. Taking the evidence to Denver was their only hope of stopping the railroad legally, but it meant leaving Kim and the children unprotected. "I'll stay with them," he decided. "Henry, you take the evidence to the federal magistrate. Get an injunction to stop the railroad's land seizure. That leaves you badly outnumbered if Blackwood decides to finish this tonight." "I know, but we don't have any other choice." Henry studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "There might be another way. I could send word to the reservation, ask for volunteers to help guard Mrs. Boon and her children. The Ute Council has a vested interest in stopping this railroad. They won't mind helping." "How long would that take?" "If I leave now, I could be back with help by tomorrow evening. That gives us time to prepare for whatever Blackwood has planned. And if he attacks before then," Henry's smile was sharp as a blade, "then you'll have to do what you did in that burning building, trust in whatever miracle has been guiding you." The older man's words sent a chill down Noel's spine. Henry had clearly noticed something unusual about his rescue of the family, something that couldn't be explained by luck or determination alone. The silver in his pocket pulsed gently, as if acknowledging the truth they were both dancing around. "There's something else," Henry continued quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "While you were in that building, I heard Blackwood talking to his men. They're not just trying to clear your sister-in-law's farm, they're planning to raze the entire valley. Every homestead, every farm, every building that stands in their way. That's dozens of families." "Exactly. And most of them don't know what's coming. Blackwood's been buying them out quietly, using legal pressure and intimidation. Your family's farm is just the last holdout." The scope of the railroad's plan began to dawn on Noel. This wasn't just about one widow's property rights. It was about the destruction of an entire community, the displacement of hundreds of people whose only crime was living in the path of corporate progress. "We need to warn them," he said. "We need to stop Blackwood permanently," Henry replied. "And that evidence is our only legal weapon. I'll ride to Denver tonight, get that injunction, and be back within a week. Can you hold out that long?" Noel looked through the doorway at Kim, who was sitting beside Thomas's bed with Mary and Joseph clustered around her. The family looked so fragile in the lamplight, so vulnerable to the forces that wanted to destroy them. But there was strength there, too, in Kim's determined expression, in Mary's protective stance over her younger brothers, in the simple fact that they'd survived this long against impossible odds. "We'll hold out," he said simply. Henry clasped his shoulder with a weathered hand. "Your brother would be proud of you, Noel Boon. You're finally fighting for something worth dying for." After Henry left for Denver, the long night began. Doc Harrison had barricaded his office as best he could, but they all knew the flimsy wooden walls wouldn't stop determined men with guns. Noel positioned himself by the front window, his rifle loaded and ready, while Kim kept watch over her children in the back room. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Every sound from the street outside, every footstep, every horse's whinny, every creaking board might signal the beginning of Blackwood's final assault. But as the night wore on and dawn approached without attack, Noel began to wonder if they'd gained a temporary reprieve. That hope died when the sun came up and revealed what Blackwood had been doing while they waited. "Sweet Jesus," Doc Harrison whispered, looking out the front window. "Look at that." Noel joined him at the window and felt his blood turn to ice. During the night, Blackwood's men had positioned themselves in buildings throughout the town center, turning Leadville's main street into a killing field. He could see rifle barrels glinting from second-story windows, men stationed on rooftops and armed guards controlling every avenue of escape. "It's a siege," Noel said quietly. "More than that," Harrison replied. "It's a trap. He's not just trying to force you out. He's making sure you can't leave alive." From the back room came Kim's voice, tight with fear. "Thomas is awake." Noel hurried to the boy's bedside, where Thomas was trying to sit up despite his mother's gentle restraint. His eyes were clear but confused, like someone waking from a disturbing dream. "Where are we?" the boy asked weakly. "Doc Harrison's office." Kim said soothingly. You hit your head in the fire, but you're going to be fine. Thomas's gaze found Noel standing in the doorway, and something flickered in his expression, recognition perhaps, or curiosity about this stranger who'd appeared in their lives during the worst crisis they'd ever faced. You're the man who carried me out of the fire, Thomas said. It wasn't a question. Yes, I remember flying like I was floating on air. Kim's sharp intake of breath told Noel that she'd heard the same thing, that Thomas's fevered memories matched her own impossible observations. The boy had been unconscious during the rescue, but somehow he'd sensed the supernatural nature of their escape. You were hurt, Noel said carefully. Sometimes head injuries cause strange dreams. It wasn't a dream. Thomas struggled to sit up at his young face, earnest, with the certainty that only children possessed. I felt it, like there was something warm and bright keeping me safe even when everything else was burning. The silver in Noel's pocket pulsed once gently, as if acknowledging the truth of the boy's words. Kim's eyes met his across the bed, and he saw his own questions reflected there. What was the silver? Where had it come from? And why had it chosen him to be its bearer? Before anyone could pursue those questions further, the sound of boots on the wooden sidewalk outside announced visitors. Noel moved to the window and saw Cornelius Blackwood approaching with a full escort, 6 men with rifles, all of them moving with the coordinated precision of a military unit. He's coming, Noel warned quietly. Doc Harrison opened the door before Blackwood could knock his medical bag in hand, and his manner professionally neutral. Mr. Blackwood, I hope you're not here on medical business. Not at all, Doctor. I'm simply here to conclude some outstanding negotiations with Mrs. Boon. Blackwood's smile was arctic. I trust her injured son is recovering. He'll live, which is more than I can say for anyone who threatens my patients. Threats. My dear doctor, I'm simply a businessman trying to resolve a property dispute, though I must say recent events have made me impatient for a resolution. Blackwood pushed past Harrison into the office, his men following like a pack of well-dressed wolves. In the confined space, their presence felt overwhelmingly threatening, as if violence was a living thing coiled and ready to spring. Mrs. Boon, Blackwood said pleasantly, I trust you've had time to reconsider my offer. Kim emerged from the back room, leaving her children under Mary's protection. Her face was pale but determined, her spine straight with the kind of courage that couldn't be broken by threats or intimidation. I'll never sell to you, she said simply. That farm is my children's inheritance, their father's legacy. You can burn down every building in Leadville, but you'll never get your hands on our land. How unfortunate. Because you see, I've just received word from my associates in Denver. It seems your advocate never reached the federal magistrate. Poor Mr. Littlefeather apparently suffered a tragic accident on the mountain road. Bandits, the marshal believes. Terrible how dangerous these frontier trails can be. The words hit Noel like physical blows. Henry was dead, killed by Blackwood's men to prevent the evidence from reaching federal court. The proof that could have saved Kim's farm and stopped the railroad's illegal land grab was probably burning in some remote canyon along with the body of a good man who died trying to help them. You murdering bastard, Noel said quietly. Strong words from a man who's killed his own brother, Blackwood replied smoothly. Yes, Mr. Boon, I know all about your sordid family history. Amazing what old court records can reveal when one knows where to look. Kim's gasp told Noel that Blackwood had just destroyed his last chance at redemption. The truth about David's death, the real truth, not the sanitized version he'd planned to tell her, was now in the hands of the enemy to be twisted and used as another weapon against them. 20 years ago, Blackwood continued conversationally. Noel Boon shot his brother David in cold blood during a drunken argument, then fled into the mountains to avoid prosecution. The territorial marshal still has an active warrant for his arrest. Imagine poor Mrs. Boon's shock when she discovers that the man she's been trusting with her children's lives is actually their father's murderer. That's not how it happened, Noel said desperately, but he could see in Kim's face that the damage was done. The carefully constructed hope he'd built over the past few days crumbled like a house of cards in a hurricane. Isn't it? Blackwood's smile was triumphant. Tell me, Mr. Boon, did you or did you not put a bullet in your brother's chest? Did you or did you not leave his body unburied while you ran like a coward into the wilderness? Every word was true, even if the context was wrong. Noel had pulled the trigger even if it was an accident. He had left David's body even if it was to protect Kim from a lynch mob. The facts, stripped of nuance and explanation, painted him as exactly the kind of monster Blackwood was describing. Kim, he said quietly, let me explain. Explain what? Her voice was raw with betrayal and pain. Explain how you killed my husband and then had the nerve to come back and play the hero. Explain how you let me trust you with my children's lives. It was an accident, a stupid, drunken accident that I've regretted every day for 20 years. An accident? Kim's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. You accidentally shot your own brother and then accidentally ran away. You accidentally let me believe he died in a mining cave-in. How many accidents can one man have? Noel. There was no answer to that. No defense that wouldn't sound like more lies and excuses. Noel had spent 20 years crafting a version of events that minimized his guilt and maximized his victimhood. But the stark truth was exactly what Blackwood had said. He'd killed his brother and abandoned his family when they needed him most. Touching, Blackwood observed. But we really must move on to more pressing matters. Mrs. Boon, you now have a choice. You can sign over your property rights to the Pacific Mountain Railroad and accept our generous compensation, or you can continue to harbor a wanted fugitive and face the consequences. What consequences? The territorial marshal is on his way from Denver with a warrant for Mr. Boon's arrest. He should arrive within the hour. When he does, he'll find a dangerous criminal who's been threatening innocent railroad employees and terrorizing a widow with small children. Resisting arrest would be unfortunate, but hardly surprising for a man with blood on his hands. The trap was perfect in its simplicity. If Kim signed over the farm, she'd lose everything David had worked for, but her children would live. If she refused, Blackwood would have Noel killed resisting arrest and then burn down everything she cared about in retaliation. But there was a third option, one that Noel was only beginning to understand. The silver in his pocket had grown warm again, pulsing with that familiar rhythm that seemed to sync with his heartbeat. But this time, instead of the burning heat that had guided him through the fire or the weightless sensation that had carried him safely from the window, he felt something different. He felt connected. Connected to the mountains that surrounded Leadville, to the deep veins of ore that ran through the earth, to the very bedrock of Colorado Territory itself. And in that connection he sensed others, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, moving through the valleys and canyons that surrounded the town. The Ute Nation riding in force toward Leadville with weapons in their hands and vengeance in their hearts. Henry Littlefeather had gotten through after all. There's something you should know, Blackwood, Noel said quietly, moving to the window and looking out at the armed men positioned throughout the town. Henry didn't go to Denver alone. What are you talking about? He sent runners to the reservation before he left. The Ute Council has been watching your railroad's operations, and they don't appreciate your plans to violate treaty lands. Right about now, I'd say there are 200 or 300 armed warriors surrounding this town, and they're not here to negotiate. It was a bluff, but the silver's warmth gave him confidence that it was a bluff with teeth. Something was coming. He could feel it in his bones, in the way the morning air seemed to hum with potential energy. Blackwood's smile faltered slightly. You're lying. Am I? Look around, Blackwood. Notice anything different about this morning? Where are the miners heading to their claims? Where are the merchants opening their shops? This town is too quiet, like every person with sense has found somewhere else to be. The railroad man moved to the window, scanning the streets. with growing unease. Leadville was indeed unusually quiet for a weekday morning, but that could be explained by the previous night's fire and the visible presence of armed men throughout the town center. Even if that were true, Blackwood said carefully, the Ute have no legal authority in territorial matters. This is a civil dispute between private parties. Not anymore. When you killed Henry Littlefeather, you murdered a member of the Ute Council on treaty land. That makes it a federal crime and a violation of sovereign Indian rights. The warriors out there aren't coming to mediate. They're coming for justice. A distant sound drifted through the morning air, a sound that made Blackwood's face go pale and sent his men reaching for their weapons. It was singing dozens of voices raised in the ancient war chants of the Ute people, growing louder as the singers approached the town's outskirts. Impossible, Blackwood whispered. Is it? You've been so focused on your legal maneuvers and corporate schemes that you forgot this is still frontier territory. Out here, justice doesn't always come from judges and juries. Sometimes it comes from people who remember the old ways, the ways that don't require lawyers or legislation. The singing was getting closer now, accompanied by the rhythmic thunder of horses' hooves on frozen ground. Through the window, Noel could see Blackwood's men beginning to shift nervously, their confidence shaken by the approaching sounds of war. But Blackwood himself wasn't finished. With the desperate courage of a cornered rat, he drew his pistol and pointed it directly at Kim's head. "Then we'll settle this the old way," he snarled. "Sign the papers, Mrs. Boon, or I'll paint these walls with your blood." That's when the silver in Noel's pocket suddenly blazed with heat so intense it felt like molten metal against his skin. But instead of pain, the sensation brought clarity, a perfect understanding of what the silver was, what it wanted, and what it was capable of. It wasn't just a miraculous healing or a supernatural enhancement of his natural abilities. It was a conduit, a bridge between the physical world and something far older and more powerful. Through that bridge flowed the strength of mountains, the patience of stone, and the inexorable force of justice itself. Noel didn't draw his gun. He didn't need to. Instead, he simply looked at Cornelius Blackwood and said, "No." The word carried weight that seemed to press against the very air in the room. Blackwood's gun hand began to shake, not with fear, but with some external force that made his muscles spasm and twitch. His finger tried to squeeze the trigger, but it wouldn't obey his commands. "What's happening?" Blackwood gasped, struggling against paralysis that was spreading up his arm. "Justice," Noel said simply. The paralysis reached Blackwood's shoulder, then his chest, freezing him in place like a statue carved from living flesh. His eyes were wide with terror and incomprehension, but he could no longer speak, could no longer move, could only stand there and experience the weight of every life he'd destroyed, every family he'd displaced, every law he'd broken in pursuit of railroad profits. His men raised their rifles, but before they could fire, the doors and windows of Doc Harrison's office exploded inward as Ute warriors poured into the building. The railroad gunmen found themselves surrounded by men who moved like shadows and struck like lightning, their modern weapons useless against opponents who seemed to anticipate their every move. The fight lasted less than 30 seconds. When it was over, Blackwood's men lay unconscious on the floor, their weapons scattered and broken. Blackwood himself remained frozen in place, a living monument to the consequences of unchecked greed and corporate arrogance. Standing in the doorway was a figure Noel thought he'd never see again. Henry Littlefeather, very much alive and accompanied by 24 Ute warriors in full battle regalia. "You look surprised to see me," Henry said with a slight smile. "Blackwood said you were dead, killed by bandits on the Denver Road." "I was attacked, but not by bandits. Railroad men, probably the same ones who tried to stop us at Sleeping Bear Rock. They made the mistake of thinking one old Indian couldn't handle 3 young thugs with guns." Henry's smile turned predatory. "They were wrong." Kim was staring at the paralyzed Blackwood with a mixture of fascination and horror. "What did you do to him?" Nothing permanent, Noel said, though he wasn't entirely certain that was true. The silver in his pocket was cooling now, its supernatural heat fading back to the gentle warmth he'd grown accustomed to. He'll recover in a few hours, maybe a day. And then he'll face federal justice for the murder of a Ute council member and the attempted theft of treaty lands. Henry moved to examine Blackwood's frozen form with professional interest. The territorial marshal is indeed on his way from Denver, but not with a warrant for your arrest, Noel. He's coming to arrest Cornelius Blackwood on federal charges. How the evidence reached the federal magistrate after all. I didn't go to Denver myself. I sent 3 riders on separate routes, each carrying copies of our documentation. One of them got through, and the magistrate issued an immediate injunction against the railroad's land seizure. He also sent word to the territorial marshal about Blackwood's illegal activities. Hope flared in Noel's chest like a struck match. The farm is safe. The farm is safe. The railroad will have to find another route for their tracks, one that doesn't violate treaty rights or destroy established homesteads. Kim sank into a chair, the weight of relief and exhaustion finally overwhelming her. It's really over. It's over, Henry confirmed. Blackwood's corporate masters will disavow his actions, blame everything on a rogue employee who exceeded his authority. The Pacific Mountain Railroad will pay substantial damages to the families they tried to displace, and they'll be under federal oversight for any future expansion plans. From the back room came the sound of children's voices, Mary comforting her younger brothers, all of them beginning to understand that the nightmare was finally ending. Thomas appeared in the doorway, still pale from his injury but steady on his feet. "Ma," he said quietly, "are we going home now?" Kim looked at her son, then at Noel, her expression a complex mixture of emotions he couldn't quite read. The truth about David's death still lay between them like an open wound, but the immediate danger was past and her children were safe. "Yes, sweetheart," she said finally, "we're going home." As the Ute warriors escorted Blackwood's unconscious men from the building, Henry moved to Noel's side and spoke quietly so the others couldn't hear. "The silver," he said simply. "What is it?" Noel considered lying or deflecting, but this man had risked his life to help save Kim's farm. He deserved the truth, or at least as much of it as Noel understood. "I don't know," he said honestly. "It came from a tumor on my arm, something that should have been impossible. Ever since then, it's been guiding me, I suppose, helping me do things that shouldn't be possible. My grandmother used to tell stories about such things. Sacred metals that fell from the sky, carrying the power of spirits and ancestors. She said they chose their bearers carefully, appearing only when justice demanded a champion. You think the silver chose me? I think 20 years of guilt and isolation prepared you to be chosen. Your brother's death wasn't murder, Noel. It was a tragedy that shaped you into the man who could save his family when they needed salvation most." The words hit Noel with unexpected force. For 2 decades, he'd carried David's death like a millstone around his neck, convinced that he was forever damned by that moment of drunken violence. But perhaps Henry was right. Perhaps everything that had happened, the accident, the guilt, the exile, even the mysterious appearance of the silver, had been leading to this moment when he could finally fulfill the promise he'd made to his dying brother, to take care of Kim and the children, to protect what David had built, to be the man his brother had always believed he could become. The silver pulsed once more in his pocket gently, like a heartbeat synchronizing with his own. And for the first time in 20 years, Noel Boon felt something he'd thought was lost forever. He felt forgiveness, not from Kim, not from his dead brother, but from himself. The long journey toward redemption was finally beginning. The territorial marshal arrived 3 hours later, just as Henry had predicted, but instead of arresting Noel, he placed Cornelius Blackwood in federal custody. The railroad man had recovered from his mysterious paralysis, though he remained strangely subdued, his earlier arrogance replaced by a haunted expression. that suggested he'd experienced something during those frozen moments that had fundamentally changed his understanding of the world. "You'll be facing charges in federal court," Marshal Williams informed Blackwood as his deputies secured the shackles. "Murder of a tribal council member, conspiracy to defraud the federal government, attempted theft of treaty lands, and about a dozen other violations that'll keep you behind bars for the rest of your natural life." Blackwood said nothing, his eyes distant and unfocused. When the marshal's men led him away, he walked like a man in a dream, offering no resistance and showing none of his former defiance. Whatever the silver had done to him during those moments of paralysis had apparently left permanent marks on his soul. As the last of the railroad men disappeared into custody, Doc Harrison emerged from the back room where he'd been tending to Thomas. "The boy's recovering well," he announced. "No permanent damage, though he'll need rest for another few days." "Thank you, Doctor," Kim said quietly, "for everything. Don't thank me, thank your brother-in-law there. If he hadn't gotten you out of that burning building." Harrison shook his head. "I've been practicing medicine for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like what he did. Jumping from a second-story window with an unconscious child and landing soft as a feather, that's not humanly possible." Kim's eyes found Noel's across the room, and he saw the same questions there that had been haunting him since the tumor first burst on the mountain trail. What was the silver? Where had it come from, and what did its presence in their lives mean for the future? "We should head home," she said finally. "The children need familiar surroundings, and I need to see what's left of our belongings after the fire." The ride back to the farm took most of the afternoon, with Thomas riding double behind Mary and Joseph chattering excitedly about the adventures of the past few days. The boy seemed to have no clear memory of the supernatural aspects of his rescue, which was probably for the best. Some experiences were too large for young minds to hold without breaking. Noel rode slightly apart from the family, giving them space to process everything that had happened while wrestling with his own turbulent emotions. The silver in his pocket had returned to its normal, gentle warmth, but he could feel its presence like a constant reminder of the impossible things he'd done and the questions that remained unanswered. The Boon farm sat in a natural valley about 10 miles northeast of Leadville, surrounded by snow-covered fields that would green with wheat and corn come spring. The house itself was modest but well built, a 2-story structure of log and stone that David had constructed with his own hands during the early years of his marriage. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating that neighbors had kept the fires burning during the family's absence. As they approached the house, people began emerging from the outbuildings and fields, neighbors and friends who'd been watching over the property, feeding the livestock and preparing for the family's return. Noel recognized some of them from his youth, before the terrible night that had driven him into the mountains, though 20 years had aged them all beyond easy recognition. "Kim," called out a gray-haired woman who came hurrying from the barn. "Thank God you're safe. When we heard about the fire in town—" "We're fine, Sarah," Kim replied, dismounting and accepting the woman's embrace. "Shaken up, but fine." "And who's this?" Sarah asked, her eyes fixing on Noel, with the frank curiosity of someone who'd lived in farming country long enough to know every face for 50 miles around. Kim hesitated, and Noel could see her struggling with how to introduce him. The truth about his identity was bound to come out. Eventually, Leadville was too small for secrets, but the wounds were still too fresh for casual revelation. "This is Noel," she said finally. "He helped us during the trouble with the railroad." Sarah's weathered face broke into a welcoming smile. "Well, any friend of Kim's is welcome here. You folks must be hungry. I've got stew keeping warm in the kitchen." As the neighbors gathered around to hear the story of their confrontation with Blackwood, Noel found himself standing apart again, watching the easy camaraderie of people who'd known each other for years and supported each other through every crisis and celebration. This was what David had died for, not just the land itself, but the community. It supported the connections that turned scattered homesteads into something approaching civilization. It was Mary who noticed his isolation and came to stand beside him. her teenage eyes wise beyond their years. "You look sad," she observed. "Not sad," Noel said carefully. "Just thinking about my father." The question caught him off guard. He'd assumed the children knew nothing about his relationship to David, but Mary's expression suggested otherwise. "What do you know about your father?" he asked. "I know he had a brother who went away before I was born. Mama never talks about him, but sometimes when she thinks we're not looking, she gets this expression on her face, like she's remembering something painful." Noel was quiet for a moment, watching Kim as she spoke with the neighbors. Even now, surrounded by friends and safety, there was a tension in her posture that spoke of old hurts never fully healed. "Your father was a good man," he said finally. "The best man I ever knew. Were you friends?" "We were brothers." Mary's sharp intake of breath told him she'd made the connection. "Your Uncle Noel, the one who died in the war." "I didn't die in the war, Mary. I just went away." "Why?" The simple question carried the weight of 20 years' worth of explanation, excuse, and self-recrimination. How did he tell a 16-year-old girl that her father had died because of his older brother's drunken stupidity? How did he explain the cowardice that had kept him away from her childhood, the guilt that had robbed her of the uncle she should have known? "Because I did something terrible," he said simply. "Something that hurt your mother and broke apart our family. I thought staying away was the right thing to do." "But you came back." "Yes." "Why now?" Noel touched the silver in his pocket, feeling its gentle warmth through the fabric of his coat. "Because sometimes a man gets a second chance to do the right thing, and sometimes miracles happen when we need them most." Mary studied his face with the penetrating gaze that seemed to run in the Boon family. "Mama's been sad for a long time. Even when she's laughing or telling stories, there's something sad in her eyes. Maybe your coming back will help with that. Maybe, or maybe it'll make things worse." "There's only one way to find out." Before Noel could respond, Thomas appeared at his sister's side, moving carefully but under his own power. The boy's head wound was healing well, but Doc Harrison's warnings about rest and avoiding excitement still applied. "Ma says you're our uncle," Thomas said without preamble. "The one who's been living in the mountains." "That's right. Were you really a hermit like in the fairy tales?" Despite everything, Noel found himself smiling. "I suppose I was, though there weren't any princesses or talking animals where I lived. Just mountains and trees and a lot of loneliness." "Why did you decide to stop being a hermit?" "Out of the mouths of babes." Thomas's question cut straight to the heart of everything Noel had been struggling with since the tumor first burst and the silver fell into his palm. Why had he come down from the mountain? What had driven him to seek human contact after 20 years of deliberate isolation? "I found something," he said carefully. "Something that made me think it was time to stop hiding." "What kind of something?" Before Noel could answer, Kim appeared beside them, her expression unreadable. "Children, go help Mrs. Patterson with the supper preparations. I need to speak with your uncle privately." Mary and Thomas exchanged glances, but obeyed without argument, leaving Noel and Kim alone beside the split-rail fence that surrounded the house. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled with 20 years of questions and recriminations that neither of them quite knew how to bridge. "They don't know," Kim said finally, "about what happened that night. I told them their father had a brother who died in the war because I couldn't bear to tell them the truth." "What is the truth, Kim?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." She turned to face him fully, her green eyes searching his face for answers he wasn't sure he possessed. "Blackwood said you murdered David in cold blood. You said it was an accident. Which version am I supposed to believe?" Noel had known this moment would come, had dreaded it, since the first moment he'd seen her outside the land office in Leadville. But now, standing in the place where David had lived and worked and dreamed of building a future, he found the courage to tell her everything. He told her about the drinking, about the argument over money and the farm's future. He told her about the jealousy and resentment that had poisoned his words, about the moment of violence that had sent David stumbling backward into the corner where the rifle waited. He told her about the terrible accident of the gun's discharge, about holding his brother as he died, about the promise he'd made to take care of her and the children. He asked me to watch over you. Noel finished, his voice barely above a whisper. His last words were about making sure you and the baby were provided for, and I ran like a coward instead of honoring that promise. Kim was quiet for a long time, staring out over the fields that would soon be green with spring growth. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but filled with a pain that cut deeper than any accusation. I waited for you, she said. After David's funeral, I waited for months, thinking you might come back to help with the farm, or at least to explain what had happened. When you didn't, I convinced myself that you'd killed him deliberately and fled to avoid justice. I know, I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't give me back 20 years, Noel. Sorry doesn't erase the nights I lay awake wondering how I was going to feed 3 children on a failing farm. Sorry doesn't bring back the brother-in-law who should have been there when Mary took her first steps or when Thomas learned to ride a horse. Each word was a nail driven into the coffin of his hopes for redemption. Noel had known that forgiveness wouldn't come easily, but hearing the full cost of his absence laid out in Kim's measured tones made him understand just how much damage his cowardice had caused. You're right, he said simply. I can't undo what I did or make up for what I failed to do, but I can try to do better from now on if you'll let me. With what you've been living alone on a mountain for 20 years, what do you have to offer my family now? It was a fair question, and one Noel had been asking himself since the moment he'd decided to come down from his cabin. What did a hermit miner have to offer a widow and her children beyond the mysterious protection of the silver in his pocket? I have some money saved, he said. Enough to help with the farm expenses, maybe buy some better equipment or livestock. And I know the mountains know where the good hunting and fishing spots are. I could teach the boys skills they'll need as they grow up. And in return, I get the chance to honor the promise I made to David, to be the uncle your children should have had all along. Kim studied his face in the gathering twilight, her expression impossible to read. Around them, the sounds of domestic life continued, neighbors preparing supper, children playing in the yard, the comfortable routine of a farming community settling in for the evening. There's something else, she said finally. Something that happened during the fire and again when you faced down Blackwood. Things that don't make sense according to any law of nature, I understand. Noel's hand moved instinctively to his pocket, where the silver pulsed gently against his palm. What do you mean? I mean jumping from a second-story window and landing like a feather. I mean somehow paralyzing a man just by looking at him. I mean shooting with impossible accuracy while riding a galloping horse on a narrow mountain trail. Kim's voice dropped to a whisper. What are you, Noel? What's happened to you up there in the mountains? The moment of truth had arrived. The choice between continuing to hide behind half-truths and evasions or trusting her with the full impossible reality of his situation. The silver grew warmer in his pocket, as if encouraging honesty. I found something, he said finally, or maybe it found me. I don't fully understand it myself, but 3 days ago a tumor burst on my arm and produced this instead of infection. He withdrew the silver sphere from his pocket, holding it up so Kim could see its perfect surface reflecting the last rays of the setting sun. In the twilight, it seemed to glow with its own internal light, beautiful and mysterious and utterly impossible. Kim stared at the object for a long moment, then slowly reached out to touch it. The moment her finger made contact with its surface, she gasped and jerked her hand back as if she'd been burned. It's warm, she whispered, and I felt something, like a voice speaking without words, trying to tell me something important. It's been guiding me, Noel said, helping me do things I never could have done on my own, saving your children from the fire, fighting off Blackwood's men, finding the strength to finally come down from the mountain and face what I'd done to our family. What is it? I don't know. Henry Littlefeather thought it might be something sacred, something connected to his people's beliefs about spirits and justice. All I know is that it appeared when I needed it most, and it's been pushing me to do the right thing ever since. Kim was quiet for a long time, her eyes fixed on the silver sphere as if trying to read some message written in its gleaming surface. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of wonder that hadn't been there before. David used to say that miracles happened when people needed them most, but only if they were brave enough to recognize them and wise enough to use them properly. She looked up at Noel, her green eyes reflecting the silver's gentle glow. Maybe this is his way of making sure his promise to me gets kept even 20 years late. Do you think he'd forgive me for what happened that night? I think David forgave you before he died, Noel. The question is whether you can forgive yourself. The silver pulsed once more in his palm, warm and encouraging, and Noel felt something deep in his chest begin to uncurl, a knot of guilt and self-recrimination that had been wound tight for 2 decades. Forgiveness wasn't something that happened all at once, he realized. It was a process, a daily choice to let go of the past and focus on building something better in the future. What happens now? He asked. Now we go inside and have supper with our neighbors. Tomorrow you can help me figure out what repairs the farm needs after this winter. Next week you can start teaching Thomas how to handle a rifle properly and maybe show Mary some of those mountain skills you mentioned. And after that, Kim smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since their reunion. After that, we build the life David always dreamed of. A family working together, taking care of each other, making this land bloom with everything it was meant to be. As they walked toward the house where lamplight spilled warm and golden, from the windows Noel felt the weight of 20 years' guilt, finally beginning to lift from his shoulders. The silver in his pocket pulsed gently, like a heart beating in rhythm with his own, and he understood that this miraculous gift had never been about the silver itself. It had been about giving him the courage to come home, the strength to fight for what mattered, and the wisdom to recognize that redemption was always possible for those brave enough to seek it. Inside the house, the children were setting the table while the neighbors shared stories and laughter around the kitchen fire. Mary looked up as they entered, her young face bright with curiosity and hope. "Uncle Noel," she said, "Mrs. Patterson was just telling us about the barn raising next month. All the families in the valley are going to help build the Hendersons a new barn after theirs burned down in the December storms." "That sounds like a fine tradition," Noel replied. "She says you should come help, you being family and all." Noel glanced at Kim, who nodded encouragingly. "I think that sounds like an excellent idea," she said. "It's time this family started participating in community events again." As they sat down to supper, Thomas claimed the chair beside Noel, his young face animated with excitement. "Will you really teach me to shoot, Uncle Noel? Ma says I'm old enough to learn proper gun safety. If your mother approves, I'd be honored to teach you. But first, you need to finish healing from that knock on the head. No excitement for at least another week, doctor's orders." "I'm fine," Thomas protested, though his careful movements suggested otherwise. "Being fine and being healed are 2 different things," Noel said gently. "Good mountain men learn patience before they learn anything else. The wilderness doesn't forgive careless mistakes." Joseph, the youngest, leaned forward eagerly. "Will you tell us stories about living in the mountains, about the animals and the weather and the gold you found?" "I found silver, not gold," Noel corrected. "And yes, I suppose I could tell you some stories, though I should warn you most of them involve a lot of cold hunger and loneliness. Hermit life isn't as romantic as the fairy tales make it sound." "But you survived," Mary observed. "For 20 years all by yourself. That takes real strength." "It takes stubbornness," Noel replied. "Strength is what it took to come back down and face the consequences of my mistakes." As the evening wore on and the neighbors gradually departed for their own homes, The Boon family found themselves alone together for the first time since the crisis began. The children helped clear the dishes and bank the fires, then gathered around the kitchen table where Kim spread out the account books that tracked the farm's finances. "We lost some money during the railroad troubles," she explained to Noel. "Had to neglect the winter preparations while we were fighting for our legal rights. But with spring coming and the land secure, we should be able to recover quickly." Noel studied the careful columns of figures, noting the small margins and careful economies that had kept the farm running despite every obstacle. "You've done an incredible job, Kim. David would be proud of how you've kept his dream alive. It wasn't just his dream, it was ours together. This farm represents everything we believed in: hard work, family building, something lasting for our children. And now we make it even better. The railroad threat is gone, the children are safe, and we have an extra pair of hands to help with the work." She smiled at him across the table. "Welcome home, Noel." The words hit him with unexpected force, carrying a weight of acceptance and forgiveness that he'd never dared hope for. Home. After 20 years of exile, 20 years of self-imposed punishment, he was finally home. Later that night, as the family settled in for sleep, Noel found himself standing alone on the front porch, looking out over the snow-covered fields that would soon green with spring growth. The silver in his pocket pulsed gently, its warmth a constant reminder of the impossible journey that had brought him to this moment. A sound from inside made him turn, Kim's voice soft and low, singing a lullaby to Joseph as she tucked him into bed. It was the same song their mother had sung to him and David when they were children, a melody that carried all the love and protection a family could offer. Through the window he could see Mary helping Thomas prepare for bed, the two older children working together with the easy cooperation of siblings who'd learned to depend on each other. This was what David had died for, what Kim had fought to preserve, what the silver had given Noel the power to protect. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the daily work of farming, the careful process of rebuilding relationships that had been broken for too long, the ongoing mystery of the silver and what it might demand of him in the future. But tonight, for the first time in 20 years, Noel Boon was exactly where he belonged. The silver pulsed once more against his heart, warm and peaceful, and he understood that its work was not finished. There would be other families to protect, other injustices, to fight other opportunities, to choose courage over cowardice. The miraculous gift that had burst from his diseased flesh was not just about his personal redemption, it was about becoming the kind of man who stood between the innocent and those who would harm them. But that was tomorrow's burden. Tonight he was simply Uncle Noel come home at last, to the family that had never stopped hoping for his return, guided by silver light and powered by love that even 20 years of separation couldn't diminish. Inside the house, the lullaby ended, and the lamps were extinguished one by one. Soon the only lights visible were the stars scattered across the Colorado sky, like silver dust, cold and distant, but somehow comforting in their eternal presence. Noel pulled his coat tighter against the mountain chill and went inside to begin the long, wonderful work of becoming part of a family again. The silver scar on his arm, for there was a scar now thin and pale where the tumor had been, would always remind him of the miracle that had changed his life. But more importantly, it would remind him that redemption was always possible for those brave enough to face their failures and strong enough to build something better from the wreckage of their mistakes. In the darkness of the Colorado night, surrounded by the love he'd thought he'd lost forever, Noel Boon finally found peace.